Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Production Value Matters, the business events podcast. And we are here on our next monthly panel, which we're all working out and workshopping in the background for a much better title because I felt like that was a little bit on the nose. Joining me this month, as usual, is Candice, Evan, and Nick. Hi, guys. How are you?
Very well.
Yay.
And so because this is going to be, because of our airing schedule, this is going to be our last panel episode for 2024. We'll be taking a little bit of a break during the month of December because it's very holiday themed. And why would you want to listen about engagement metrics and post-event surveys while you're trying to rush around doing your Christmas shopping or whatever shopping you may be participating in? So we thought that this episode should really be about looking ahead to 2025. And on a personal note, I think it's going to be a very interesting and exciting year for the events industry. There's been a lot of sort of groundswell of some changes over the last several years, but certainly over 2024. But there are some things that are going to affect us as an industry over the next few years and certainly into 2025. The three things that I think we should talk about on this panel today are certainly the changing audience and engagement strategies out there. I think even Julia Solaris today in his latest newsletter was emphasizing that there's a lot of change in that aspect happening. The second thing is more leaning from our previous episode on the changing workforce. Like, what does that change in workforce predict for the next year in the event industry? And then finally, we know this may be a sensitive topic, but we felt like we should talk about the potential economic impacts since the election results in the United States. There have been some very clear and very
Go on.
strong. What's that?
I'm waiting to hear the choice of words. Am I the only person in the US here or no?
No, Candice is.
Oh, Candice, you are too? Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Phew. That takes a lot of the pressure off. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
Yeah. So look, we are not going to talk about politics on this podcast. The American people made a very democracy worked. It's exactly what was supposed to happen happened, and the American people have made a very clear choice. So we have no opinion. What we want to set up in that part of the discussion, which we will get to, is what are the realities of those economic policies and how will they affect the events industry going forward, in our opinion. Again, this is all opinion. This is all hopefully backed by some facts, but it is not going to be a political discussion. So if anybody was worried about that in listening to this episode, don't worry about it. And of course, you can always go to productionvaluematters.com and sign up for the podcast, and you'll get access to more deep dives on all of these subjects and past episodes, of course. Okay, so let's get into our first topic today, which is let's talk about engagement metrics and the changing audience. We sort of touched base on it in our last episode, but Evan, this is one of the things you want to talk about. So tell us what you think people should be aware of in the changing demographics and the changing engagement metrics going into 2025.
Yeah, I think, we alluded to it last time. I think we'll dive a little bit deeper this time on it. Really, for me, it's about recognizing the change, like you said, in the audience makeup, the demographic of our ICPs. As we know, the industry is skewing younger as new workforce comes in. There's not as many, let's call them mature or experienced people, more so on the new side coming in, fresh out of school, fresh on their first job, whatever it is. I think as event producers, event planners, event managers, we have to be aware of those changes. We have to be able to adapt to them. And, like we talked about before, it's like no one wants to sit and hear a 2-hour keynote speech anymore. People want quick hits. They want quick fire shots. They want, fireside chats that are 15-minute breaks. They are wanting time in between sessions to recharge their batteries, especially if you're more on the introverted side of the spectrum of how you sort of act and what you do and how you are. People want time away from sessions to be mingling and networking with people at events. So to not take up an entire day or multiple days worth of people's time just in sessions is important to be aware of and to know. But I think specifically to dive a little bit deeper, it's about changing how we set up our content and how we set up our sessions so that it's not, well, we did it last year in the 1 hour keynote, so that's what we're doing this year. Like, gone are those days where we do things because we did it last year. That's not an excuse. That's not a reason to anymore for producing events. And so being able to see the trends and adapt to trends and embrace those trends of, you know, if it's a 10-minute talk or it's a 20-minute talk or if it's a panel versus one person just talking at a group of people all day long, that's what we have to focus on. And that's what the audience is demanding. That's what our customers are demanding. That's what attendees want. And so as producers and planners, it's our job to lean into that. And it's our job to not be afraid of doing things differently and being able to realize that when we change and when we adapt to the environment and to the audience, we will get better metrics and we will get better analytics on the output of not only the intangibles, which were like things like, did you like the food? Did you like the session? Did you like the content? But in the tangibles, where it's like, based on this session that you went to, here's what you can do as an action item right away, or here's what you can do next month. What can you put into reality, and what can you do to action things that you learned? That's what people will focus on. And that's what they will remember if they're quick hit conversations, not 2 and 3 and 4 hour long sessions.
So do you think though that I agree with you that the length of session is important, but that, I think some people might hear that and go, oh, so do I do away with my general session room? Do I do away with any kind of presentational staging? And is it about that in your opinion? Or do you think it's more about you can set that stage, but you now instead of like 2 1 hour sessions, you're doing 10, 20-minute sessions. I'm doing the
Yeah,
math.
absolutely. And that's exactly what it is. It's like, yes, you still need to have that general session. Yes, there's still value in that. And maybe there is like the opportunity for a traditional keynote presentation, but I think it's the other pieces of content, the other presentations that offset. So maybe it's like, you're doing, 5 15-minute quick hit, sessions. Then you have a break in your main room, in your main stage, where maybe you have a panel discussion for one. Maybe you have a fireside chat with 2 people with a moderator. Then maybe you have your MC comes back up and is like, okay, now we're going to get into our keynote. Your keynote comes up for half an hour, then does a Q&A with the audience. That's not pre-seated questions. That's real live questions that are happening in the audience to get that engagement based on the conversation that was had. So it's, yes, still have your general session. Yes, still have your main room. I do not suggest you get rid of that. It's about how we're delivering content and how we can change up how we deliver content so people don't get bored.
And so, Candice, I want to go over to you for a second just to talk about that content pyramid that Julius published today. And I noticed at the top, for the last 3 sort of steps of the pyramid after a large space of communication strategies, et cetera, virtual, hybrid, and then live were progressively sort of smaller portions of his pyramid, but they were sort of near the top and extremely important. So in that sort of vein of changing how we engage with audiences, which are essentially, our users or, a company's users or buyers or whatever it might be, do you see in 2025 more emphasis on virtual and hybrid, or is it less? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we could probably stay on this topic all day, That's a great question. I think there will always be room for virtual events. They will always be around. I think just making them really dynamic and taking it off of going back, several years ago through the pandemic, how they all just felt the same, in some capacities. Technology has accelerated since then. So a lot of the event tech companies have really gotten some wild, really cool features that they're using, including adding in AI and a lot of other like touch points, which I think is going to be big for these events. just moving into 2025 overall, events over across the board will need very high touch points. And that is possible with hybrid and virtual events for sure. I think going back to Julius's trends for 2025, him talking about, planning moments versus planning events. And I think that's pretty powerful in itself. People these days, they want experiences like we talked about on the first episode of this podcast, especially with the newer generations coming in. And they are a lot of these attendees who are now attending these events. And they want experiences over, sitting through, a 2 hour, presentation. They want very quick, they want the important information to take away, but then they want to have their time and then come back into another session or a fireside chat, like Evan mentioned too. But yeah, I think hybrid and virtual events will always be a thing. And my approach to this is going into 2025. I see this a lot just with the other planners too. I frequently ask a lot of my other event planning friends, do you have a disaster relief plan, for if anything else were to happen? It's not, when, it's not if, it's when, right? Something else may take place in the world, knock on wood and fingers crossed and all those sorts of things. But we weren't ready for the pandemic that hit us. And it's a matter of time until the next one hits as well. So my concern, we may not be going this direction, but this is top of mind for me, is for event planners and companies to have those plans in place. So if something were to happen, when it does happen again, what are they going to be doing? Because just about everyone across the board was scrambling because they were going to be having an in-person conference, but now they have to have a virtual or a hybrid component as we kind of got further out from the pandemic. So that's my biggest thing top of mind for me right now is everyone needs a plan. We don't know what we're going into, I mean, something could happen this year. Who knows, but I'm just saying that's kind of where my mind is. And that's why I think virtual and hybrid are here to stay.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was talking to, of all people, an insurance broker this morning about some of our insurance things, and they asked me a question about, oh yeah, so when you started this business, and I was like, oh, in 2019, and they stopped for a second. I was like, oh, like right before the pandemic, and I was like, yeah, like 3 or 4 months before that, and so. It's funny that you said that because I have been thinking about that today. It's like, okay, well, do we have contingency plans always now since the pandemic of like, how do we like, not that, but again, I don't think history is going to 100% repeat itself after 5 years, but it's always a possibility. So that's a really good point to bring up. So Nick, I wanted to ask you, from the massive amounts of data that you and your company at Zenus, sort of look at on a regular basis about sentiment and how, like, what trend have you been seeing over 2024? And is that giving you sort of an idea of what 2025 might be?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest trend is everyone needs new benchmarks and everyone needs to clear their cache of what their expectations are of their attendees. Clear that browsing. My people like this, our ICP, prefers this. I would challenge all of them and say, you think that's still the case? Is there any element of the event ecosystem that hasn't been disrupted from new people planning it, new competition, new whole generations taking leadership positions, new technologies? You think any of your preconceived things still stand? And I would say some of them might, but just saying this is how people are, the big thing that we see with data is nuance, and it depends, which isn't exciting because for the most part, pundits and like shows like this are all about telling people what they should do. And the only thing I can really clearly tell people what you should do is doing a lot more testing and measuring. You should produce aspects of your events as test cases, and you should have controls to determine if these things still stand, because you'd be surprised, depending on the industry, how vastly different behaviors are. And there are depth of nuances that are going to be the 10% difference, the 10% positive that will be vitally important in a more competitive landscape that has more tools to be able to produce events with less skills maybe, or even less experience. So how do we stand out, as people with experience and with passion against very technology enabled people who aren't further ahead than us? It's going to be around not taking things for granted. I mean, anyone who says this is how it is, this is how we've always done it, is a liability at this point. Rinse, wash, and repeat is a recipe for disaster, because there's just so many variables that have changed, and the expectations of attendees have completely changed, especially around content, and content that could have been. I mean, you hear the meetings that could have been an email, the live events that could have been a YouTube video, are nearly all of them, in my opinion. Like I sit in a session and I'm like, if I go like this with my fingers and make a rectangle and look through that, am I watching a YouTube video? Is there any other element that I'm really taking in on the experiential side that's enhancing this in order for this content to stick? It's infrequently the case. So, uh, if I want knowledge, if I want information that's tactical and ready to go, I just have to say it out loud to an AI agent, and it will give me the information in bullet points in the exact moment that I need it. Planning 6 months ahead of time to buy a plane ticket, get hotel rooms, stick my spouse with my kids. That sounds like a lot of friction, when I can just get the answers I need when I need it. So what is an event? And I think we need to be asking these kinds of questions, and we need to have somewhat playing the role of a bit cynical, in order to sharpen our swords, because I can just see us using the same plays over and over again with outdated models, and having the results diminish. And that's, I mean, my key thing to insert in here somewhere is the survey work I've been reading on, the changing in sponsorship and exhibitor dollars, because like to me, like that's what we build this stuff on. And there's good news if you ignore the nuance, and then if you look at the nuance, you should get a little nervous. And that's 57%. The Involio survey that came out a couple weeks ago, 57% of exhibitors in this survey are going to be spending the exact money, that they did last year, on sponsorships and exhibitors. So that sounds positive. But then when you look at every category of cost has increased, then there's actually a shrinkage that's taking place. They're going to, I mean, the 72% of them say they're going to scale back their presence at shows, and 61% are going to send fewer staff. Like there's a lot of things that are changing in that world, and like where the money goes, the rest of it goes. So for me, I'm like, I have stakeholders in the attendees, and to try and determine what their preferences are as they change. And then I'm also looking at my sponsors and seeing what are the changes happening there. Everywhere around me has changed. So I'm an advocate of this, obviously, but I really think that we all need new benchmark. If we take something for granted, someone should challenge that and say, can we measure that to see if that's true in 2025?
Yeah, so it's interesting that just to tie into Candice's point about how things sort of changed into post-pandemic, that there was sort of that same sentiment, right? And I'll tie that into Julius's second point that he was making on his newsletter, and we're only really talking about it because it came out like 2 hours ago, so it's top of mind. But his big line was, "Look, you're not in events anymore; you're in content production." And that sort of resonated with me. And to tie into what you just said, Nick, post-pandemic, that was the biggest indicator of success post-pandemic. Was any planner, any event professional came out and said, "Oh, I'm so glad we're getting back to what we did before." We haven't heard from them. They
Yeah.
disappeared, right? Quite succinctly. And so, it's an interesting predictor. And now that, to tie into Candice's point and to Julius's statement that we're not in event production anymore, we're in content production. And I agree with that. I think, it's something I've been saying to a lot of clients for years now, that your live event should either be part of your content strategy or be the launch of that content strategy. And then you should leverage all the cool things that you have in this convention center for those 2 days into a content factory to be able to further your message. And so I'm going to tie this into our second subject, watch me weave. It'll be amazing. That, as we sort of think of the changing workforce and what we think that's going to look like in the next 6 months to a year, how much of that is going to be less of the traditional, I say traditional, like if you're listening, I'm doing the big quote fingers, but traditional sort of planner roles and live event roles that will transition and be backfilled with people who are more content savvy. Evan, why don't you sort of jump in and say what your thoughts are on that changing workforce?
I think the key to winning Gen Z and the generation that will come after them is content. I think it comes down to execution of that content. So that comes in the form of short form video like we see on TikTok and Instagram and all the other platforms that are out there. But I think it also is what the content is about. Like, I think a lot of times, our generation was more about like, what about the industry? Like, what do we like? And what makes us better as event professionals? And how can we, upskill ourselves going to industry events like IMAX, like CES, like Event Tech Live, like these events help us upskill. I think the answer to winning Gen Z and past that is kind of to Nick's point, like if I put my fingers in a box, can I see that on TikTok? Like, do I need to go to that event? If the answer is yes, then like what are we doing at that event to keep that audience engaged with the content and with the event as a whole? We know that Gen Z wants things quickly and they don't remember things after a very short time. So don't tell me something day one that I need to regurgitate and come back to you on day 4. Like, give me something tangible and actionable day 1 that I can use today in this moment.
Can I just jump in on something you just said, because it sparked a thought and I'd like to share. You said so going to IMAX and other industry events should be an opportunity to upskill. My question to all of you is that actually happening? Because every time I've gone to an industry event, if it wasn't overt, it was subversive, excuse me. But it was more about sales and business development than it was necessarily about come here. And I feel like over the last couple of years, education in the industry has gone back foot to commercial objectives, which isn't invalid, but to everybody else, do we really think that our industry events are preparing the workforce by giving those upskill opportunities to learn and specifically to train? Like, there's learning, like, come to my session and I'm going to talk about this for 20 minutes. That's not really skills development. That's talking about something versus, hey, get a hands-on workshop here where we're going to, like, from a production point of view, we're going to take apart a source for, I'm going to show you how this works, kind of thing. Right.
I think there's 2 quick things before, and I'll let other people jump in a second. I think the first point we have to make is different people in the industry go to these events for different reasons. So the reason why I would go to IMAX is very different than the way you would go to IMAX, Matt, right? You're going to build your funnel and your pipeline and make sales and get new business. I'm going to reconnect with people in the industry. I'm going to look for vendors. Going to look for partners that I want to work with to build my events, to produce my events in the best way possible. So once we delineate that answer and know that people are going to these events for different reasons and different outputs, then I think, like, totally agree with you. There needs to be a lot more hands-on learning. Like you mentioned, like with the Source 4 example, like not everyone is going to care about how a light fixture works, but to that extent, I do think we need more of that in the industry across all the different verticals, AV and printing and branding and design and content management and speaker selection and all the other topics that we think about when it comes to events, how you do a food and beverage for your event, like all of these different things. Like, go into a chef's kitchen at a venue and see how they've built their kitchen to optimize output of how they can produce 1,000 meals in 3 minutes to get them out to the tables, right? Like, all of those things we definitely need more of 100%. But I think the only way that works is if the events and that strategy is tailored to a very specific niche of the industry. That's something that I may want to go to learn as a producer, but someone who's a solopreneur or is owning an AV firm or owns a print house, do they care about those kind of things? Or are they just there to make business, to do business and fill their funnel? So I think there's a total need for it. There's a total lack of it in the industry now. But if we're going to do that and execute that properly, it's a pretty small niche of the industry that will be targeted to land successfully.
I do agree with that. And we can't just rely on events like this to help teach and educate. It really starts at a manager level. It starts at their manager, kind of having them shadow them on a lot of these different aspects within the events industry, and that's the best teacher, in my opinion. But not all of these Gen Zers may have a manager like that who really takes them alongside them and lets them shadow every step of the way with planning events, and then kind of passing the torch over to them one day. But I do think that education really does need to step up within the event, at these events. And also with Gen Z, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Gen Z, the age range goes up to 27 years old.
So.
Double check me, fact check me on that, Nick. But so that means that, yeah, I mean, 27, I mean, yeah, they could be at an event manager level at that point, sure, but they could also be an event assistant, as well. So I don't see a lot of these Gen Zers at the events that I am seeing around. Personally, I don't know if that's different for all of you all, but they may be the ones who sit in the office or sit at home remote, and their manager is going to IMEX, their manager is going to ETL, so just kind of putting that out there too.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think the strategy then is, if you're an association, if you're IMEX, if you're some organization that's vested in the development of the workforce, is it about pushing that content onto a virtual platform? Is on-demand kind of I was about to say TikTokification. I did it again. I couldn't pronounce it this week either.
By the end of the season.
Yeah, exactly. Like, is it so from what I'm interpreting, Candice, that look, you're right. It is the director of events that is going to be going to IMEX to build relationships, learn about vendors, so on and so on. Do they have any interest in going and bringing their teams to Vegas for 2 days to go sit in the kitchen and understand how you just to understand the logistics that go into feeding 3,000 people at an event, which I personally think, oh my God, that's fascinating. I want to learn that so I can better advise my teams and my clients. But, if I'm the director of events for XYZ agency and I have 30,000 employees, I'm not bringing any of them.
Right.
I'll send you the slides. Right.
Yeah.
I think it's survivor bias. I think that's the problem with all of this, is that we utilize primarily, and we lean pretty heavy on one source of truth that is doesn't help with growth or segmentation at all, and that's post-event surveys. Post-event surveys are asking one group of people who already attended our events and already understand what the premise is and have pushed through and seen our messages and know what to do, know the expectations are for them, least amount of friction. And if you use that as your source of truth, at best, you have the smallest amount of churn, no growth whatsoever, and no growth in a lot of different ways, not just attendance, but also like in services or mentality, flexibility. I think a lot of the problem starts there. And just the idea of survivor bias is what makes it so everything is aimed at people who are middle management, sales, marketing roles for all of these shows, and or are in a position of being the event organizer, but development roles of junior level positions or higher than the middle, both don't attend. In most industries, it's just not worth it to go if you're in the C-suite, unless there's some sort of specific inclusive activity that takes place there, by design for them, and they have the most to give. And then the lower level on the org charts, no one is willing to invest in them, primarily because the selling proposition isn't designed for them. So it's chicken or egg. The younger people aren't going, and they're not going because they're not being designed for, and they're not being designed for because they're not going. And it's perfect. It just is this shrink mentality. So it would take different strategies, to Evan's point, in different segmentations. You have to walk the walk. You have to invest in it. It's not going to pay off in 1 year. Most of the time that looks like a fail as opposed to iterative improvement. So you have to be committed to that as a goal, no matter what. If you're not growing your a variety of personas, then you're not succeeding in your event goals. And it really just takes multiple strategies, and you have to be able to ask questions. I would say more importantly for the people who saw your marketing material, who you would like to attend, who might be tangential and didn't attend your event. You need to double down and survey and ask those people, why didn't you come? And it'll be illuminating, having, instead of a post-event survey, you would have a churn or event rejection survey, whatever the terminology is. But that's your growth strategy, is all the people that you wish could come but didn't come, and asking them why they didn't. And using IMEX as an example, there's a dozen reasons to attend IMEX, and the C-suite does show up at IMEX. Like I watch them. I know quite a few of them at large organizations. They don't go to sessions. They're not on the show floor. They don't work booths, but they come. And what they do is they set up meetings.
Mm.
Yeah. And they're in the restaurant, and there's 5 of them, and they're 5 heavy hitters. And could they be incorporated into the event more? Maybe. Could you leverage some of their value and have that value provide, benefits to others there? Potentially. So there's a lot of different ways to cut this. You have to be really present. You have to really pay attention to people and have boots on the ground determining what's actually happening. But the ecosystem of IMEX is a great example, because it's probably the biggest thing we've got. Most of us are familiar with it, and it succeeds. It's there's essentially a waiting list for exhibiting. By all metrics, they're growing, so they're succeeding. They're looking at going out and getting sponsors and activations from people who are not normally part of the quote unquote events industry. An example, like the greater experiences industry, like Major League Baseball was an activation this year. So like for organizations saying like, okay, we only know what we know, and these are the people we work with. They're taking a leadership position and extending it beyond, and taking some opportunities to engage tangential elements of the greater industry that events are in, as an umbrella with experiences industries, just for cross-pollination and for expansion. So those are the kind of growth mentality you need to have, because if anyone's ever ran a business, if you're not growing, you're shrinking. And that's the kind of strategies that we need to have, is just like, okay, this covers our bases, what you're saying, but it doesn't actually put us somewhere we've never been before, because if we're not doing that, then we're just managing a situation that, there's a lot of change coming probably in 2025. And if we don't have strategies for growth, any one of those change factors could be the disruption that puts us outside of where we want to be.
So Nick, just to your point, Matt, was super quick. I just want to jump in really quick on something that Nick said. So we talked about the 5 or whatever it is number of C-suite people that are at IMEX. They're not on the floor. They're not on the stage giving presentations. They're not working the booth. They're at restaurants, or they're at private, networking events, let's call it. So why do they have to be at IMEX? Like, I can host a networking event with the CEO of Cvent and the CEO of whatever other company, and I can host it at a restaurant in Toronto next week. Why are these people going to IMEX? Like, if they're not involved in anything else of the event, and going back to the delivery conversation, like if they're not in the delivery, they're not in the booth, they're not on the show floor, they're not mingling with people outside of their tight circle, why are they wasting money going to IMEX in Vegas when
Well,
they
I
can
can
be
answer
at.
that. It's because all their customers are going to IMAX.
But
Right.
if they're
That-
not with their customers on the floor,
Oh, but
they don't have to be
They
there.
don't have to be.
Yeah.
I think that's the point.
They're
They don't
managing
have
their
to be.
team.
They've got a team that's meeting with the clients, and it's an incentive. It's part of a sales
Right.
and business development strategy that you're like, let's stick the CEO in a really fancy restaurant down the road, and when we get like a really high value target that we really want to like impress, I'm going to send them to go have dinner with the CEO. The thing I was going to bring up is, what is the incentive that in the development of the new and changing workforce that an IMAX or any other association or industry event needs to do to not only encourage the C-suite to come and hang out at the restaurant as a business development incentive, but also to drag along 25% of their mid-level staff who need skills development. And how do we, that leads into a question about what do we all sort of recommend that, look, if you're a young person, I say young person, or a new person in this industry who's sort of stumbled into it and is part of that changing workforce, what resources are available to them and what resources do we think we need to provide to them?
I think we have to make events like IMAX and big ones more accessible to these people. Like, I'm not going to pay $1,500 a pop and bring 25 people to the team to the event. That's going to cost me half of my budget for the entire event potentially. Like, the event has to make it accessible for people to attend to grow their numbers. And I'm not saying that events should be free, because they shouldn't, but because everyone needs to make money, obviously, and that's a big generation of income and revenue for these events outside of sponsorship dollars and everything else. But if you want to target 20 to 30 to 40 people from a company coming, you need to make the price of the ticket more realistic and more affordable. And what that means is a very subjective answer based on a company. Like, if you're Cvent or you're a solopreneur, what you determine is affordable is very different. So it's not necessarily like changing pricing based on the company or based on who it is, but maybe it's like you have packages or you have groupings of, like, if you fall into this, realm of size of company and, able to spend this much money, like, here is your sliding scale of what we will charge you to bring one person, 5 people, 10 people, 30 people. And you get price breaks on volume of tickets you're buying. If you're sponsoring, maybe you get a discount on tickets or free tickets, depending on your sponsorship level or your size of your footprint. So the money's going into the sponsorship, but then you're getting tickets to come to the event. Like, that's what we do for our events. At Intuit is, based on your sponsorship level, you get more tickets to come to the event to bring your people. So you invest in the sponsorship, you invest as a partner in the event. That's where we're seeing the money come in, and then bring as many people as we're allowing you to bring based on these levels. So I think that's how you get those opportunities.
That's a really interesting strategy. Funnily enough, in Toronto this weekend and next weekend, oh God, the traffic is going to be terrible.
Well, 500,000 people coming in.
Yeah, 100%. Because the Eras tour, is here in Toronto. And so that, leading into, I think something that Candice said about in relation to how we map out content, are we going to see the rise of tours? Tours stopped being a thing for a while because it was like, no, come to Vegas. We're gonna do a big thing in Vegas. You get on a plane, and to Nick, your point, and I think this is going back into the engagement and changing audience question from the beginning, which might be a good way to wrap that part. Is that part of that demographic change and audience change? Do we need to stop thinking of events as this one-time, one-place thing? Do we feel like there might be
one strategy thing?
Strategy thing? Absolutely. Yeah. That, it's the XYZ company show that maybe did an off-Broadway run in Ohio, But now it's going to New York, it's going to Miami, it's going to LA, it's going to blah, blah, blah. Because to your point, like that's a really expensive endeavor to say, especially in this industry, to say, hey, we want you to bring your entire sales and marketing team to exhibit at IMAX. But we also want you to bring your C-suite executives to sweeten the deal for all your customers. Great. From a business development and strategy point of view, that makes a whole lot of sense and kind of worth it. From a P&L standpoint, bringing 10 to 15% of my workforce to go take apart a light or go look in a kitchen, that's a little harder to motivate
Yeah, I
financially.
you
But
you
if
would need to
IMAX came
curate.
to Toronto and said, "Hey, we're doing an education series where, we're going to go into the MTCC, which is the Metro Toronto Convention Center, and we're going to open up the kitchen. Like we're sponsoring it. We've organized it. We've done it. You can come in and do some learn how a super kitchen works." I would go. I would
I'd
go
be the
because it's
first one
10
in
minutes
line.
down the road.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Also, if it was a series that was hybrid, you could, have your cake and eat it too by having like potentially some sort of flipped classroom expectations where you're giving them content. As we started this off about how we have to be more content savvy, giving them content leading up to the actual experience, thus less time on the ground in person, looking at our through our fingers to make that square of YouTube like content. You already consumed the YouTube content. Now let's mix it up. Let's get our hands dirty. Let's do things. And with a basis of knowledge that it ends up being the foundation. Like there's more ingredients, but we're making the same stuff, and take advantage of these ingredients and also develop something that hasn't been done, because what has been done already is so easy to rip off. I mean, that's like one of like AI's like worst contributions, is that it takes what has been and delivers it to everyone, so it's not an engine on the shelf. It's not an engine for innovation. Like you have to be kind of savvy to use it for innovation, but like mostly what it's used for is cut and paste. We have to get out of the way. I mean, events have been cut and paste forever. Like a trade show is a grid. I mean, it's just cut, paste, cut, paste. So we need to really be willing to break some things. And I also think curating that, like if you were to give like, yeah, 15% of your workforce coming to that event, that sounds awful if you give them all the same premise. But if you have different, persona types or different, org chart types with, look, here's what the experience of being there is going to look like for you. These are the expectations. These are your takeaways. This is your path for success. It's different than this person. It's different than this person. If you can give an organization 4 or 5 different pre-made paths for success based on what they need, then it looks like your whole education budget going to that is valid, because you're educating not 101 to the people that don't want to hear it, nor advanced things for the people that need 101. I mean, like using the IMAX example, all of those ingredients are out there. Like you can create, like you just have to pay attention to someone who is being successful in their role at their level, and then re-engineer how they've made their own luck. You just have to pay attention. And if you do that, you can give multiple paths to a team. The other thing that you can do is take advantage of a trend that seems like it's not going away into 2025, which is remote workforces. These teams are not coming together to meet. So why aren't we using the lightning rod that is the event? And one of the reasons I think that the CEOs do come to the events is that they're spending that time with the majority of their team who has active roles there. They don't have to have an active role. They're curating their time to be with their peers, but they do want to be there for their team because the significance of their investment is huge, and they might not see their team any other time. Like I mean, I know a lot of the C-Vent people, as an example, don't get to hang out with Reggie but once a year when he's there, as an example of that kind of like leadership. And like the volume of people that organization, as an example, has there is pretty large. But if they were to have some offsite thing that took place, and if the event itself were to sell something the day before or the day after, in conjunction with the group sales ticket, that would be pretty great, because that would be their retreat plus the event, and it would be take advantage of. It's still the same investment in flights. Maybe it's one extra hotel room, but it's not like another offsite that they're having 6 months other where the number jumps. So there's strategies like that if you look at why people are attending. And treat them differently. But I mean, people still need to come together. And your event is a lightning rod. The reason that those CEOs are going to IMEX when they could go to Toronto any night of the week is that that's where the pulse of that community is at that moment. So they're there, even if they're not actively participating in all the things that are designed for everybody else, because it says something to be there. And that's where the energy is. Like, that's where the deals are happening. And if you're not there, you feel like you're not part of the community.
Yeah, so there's one thing I want to jump on that you just said, and I think it is a really great way of personifying perhaps what not to do in 2025. Was you said, and I quote, "It's the different ingredients, but making the same thing."
Yeah.
And if I were to offer any advice to anybody who's listening, is don't do that. Right? There are so many new ingredients, new formats, new ideas flowing around. If you're trying to make those bake into the same cake, then it's just the same cake, right? And people get sick and tired of that. So we're not running out of time, but we're getting on to the time. I want to move on to this is the worst segue ever. I apologize to everybody.
Now another topic.
I was waiting I was waiting to see how you're going to cook this one up.
Yeah.
And now on the podcast. So we need to sort of chat about some of the economic impacts that are going to potentially, there's a lot of if, there's a lot of like big star if on this, because we're sitting at the time of recording right after the US election. We will acknowledge that there are a couple of Americans on this podcast and a couple of Canadians. And that, again, we're not going to talk about politics, but we are going to talk about economics, because I think that however severe or light or if or when or any of those factors that the new administration has promised on the campaign trail were key parts of the economic sell to the American people in the form of some pretty drastic economic policies. And so I want to talk a little bit about how event professionals can potentially anticipate and or prepare for some potential eventualities. And the big one I want to talk about first is tariffs. The promise has been to add significant tariffs to anything that's coming into the United States from China, and broadly 10 to 20% on everybody else. And so, having lived through, like, being a Canadian during the last administration, Trump administration, there was a tariff back and forth between Canada and the United States based on some raw materials, particularly steel and aluminum. And that had a very acute and drastic effect. And as I was driving into the office today in preparation for this, I was thinking about the last 2 years of the industry and how, costs have risen due to general global inflation. And all I started thinking was, well, hold on to your hats if we start seeing tariffs like this. So I'm going to throw it to Evan first, because Evan, you work for a financial application firm. Congratulations, by the way. By the time this airs, you will be at Scotiabank. Congratulations on the new gig.
Thank you.
And that is an organization that does events internationally, including in the United States and in Canada. And so, what are your sort of predictions for what that kind of an economic policy could do for somebody in your position?
So I'm going to preface this by saying I'm also the other Canadian on the call. I try to stay away from the political world in the US as much as humanly possible, as much as we can. And so what I will say is, while I don't have a crazy in-depth pulse on what's happening with tariffs and everything else and policy and everything that's going on, I heavily rely on my network in the US to help answer those questions. And so I think from a production and event production standpoint, I focus a lot on Canadian events and events that are executed in Canada. So thankfully, we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff as of right now to the same extent. But I definitely do think that there will be cause for concern. Not that we have to like sound off the red alarms and get the bells flashing today, but I think to Candice's point from earlier, what are you doing now to prepare for when that reality comes in? So, as an agency, for an example, are you adding in a little bit more in your management fees on your projects to offset some of those costs? As a vendor, like a supplier, like an AV company or a print house or a, you know, a company that does vinyl flooring, like, are you adding in, are you charging more for your labor to offset costs that you can get away with a little bit adding more of a pad in? We're not saying that we should add a line item on a budget that says tariff fee or cost to offset tariffs, but can we as an industry add a buffer into our budgets across the board, paying a budget or charging for a budget, both sides of that equation? Can there be an added buffer in today so that when that reality comes, and if it could come in 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years, I don't think we know when that will actually hit the fan or not. But what can we do starting in 2024 in November that we can start preparing and getting customers and vendors and partners and suppliers ready for that, so it's not a crazy, increase or crazy, steep slope when it does land, but can we start to move the needle 1% in November 24 so that people aren't, price shocked when it comes down the pipe and it eventually lands, and that when we're charging clients for things, they are still willing to pay what we're charging because we've slow crept things up in a comfortable way for them, that it's not that shell shock of, holy cow, this is 30% higher than it was last quarter or last year or last 6 months
Yeah,
when I did this event.
that was certainly the shock during the
Yeah.
return to live, and
Yeah.
that 2019 budgets for 2022 realities, right? So it was an acute shock that, hey, this widget used to cost me $100, now it cost me 130. What the hell happened? Well, a pandemic happened, and global inflation happened, and all those kind of things. So, and a revolution in how we pay people happened. So it's interesting that you say that preparation, because I will say to the audience and to everybody on this panel, I coined myself as a bit of an amateur economist, meaning like, do not take any of my advice as investment advice or financial advice. This is just what I read. And one of the things that has already started to manifest across the American economy, and certainly through North America and Europe right now, is anybody who is relying on a foreign supply chain, anything that is about reselling, retail sectors, any of the sort of reselling dealership sectors, have started to super stockpile from their current areas, and have made very strong decisions to move all of their supply chain in anticipation of this. This is a bit of an apocryphal story. I can't remember what the firm is, but somewhere in West Virginia, there are some employee Christmas bonuses that were actually canceled because they had to reallocate their funds to go stockpile. And they informed the entire staff, and it was not great news. And so I want to segue that into a question about, so how do we feel that those things, like we just talked about how this might affect how, agencies and suppliers may have to charge. And, that's the reality of tariffs, that, if I pay extra money for things, it's going to trickle down to who buys it. So how do we feel that this is going to affect our customer bases and our stakeholder bases? Because, whether or not there's their suppliers for their key businesses, let alone what they're doing for events, or may be exposed to these tariffs. How is that going to affect the things that we do for that buyer base, which is to help them motivate employees and help them rev up their sales forces or do town halls, or like, that's going to greatly affect what budgets get allocated. Because if their materials and raw material costs go skyrocketing, let alone their labor, does that discount what they're going to do as sales effort or culture building efforts within their organizations?
I think while I think what Evan said is super important, that we need to consider how we're going to ramp up our efforts for or billing or charging. I think we also need to ramp up our creativity to provide more value and more ROI. I think in tandem, because there's just going to be hard truths, and hard truths without a positive is not a. It's like an open faced sandwich of information. Not, you want to be able to have a little bit of the good and the bad in there. I also think that like creating new things is going to be vitally important, as opposed to sticker shock of, well, this used to cost this. I think you need to radically change some of the offerings that you have in order to introduce something new. And when you introduce something new, you create a new benchmark for that, and it's not so shocking. And that new thing could be in a production, a new package or new ways to sell things. Or if you're an event organizer, instead of just saying the conference ticket has gone up or sponsorship has gone up, you have new sponsorships or new events or things like that, as to just get leverage the excitement of something new, and not make it just a comparison that this is the same thing I got last year but it's more expensive. But ultimately, like if it's tariffs or anything that increases pricing, it's gonna really end up being something that you're gonna have to be transparent with your internal stakeholders to a degree, transparent with your external stakeholders, and the consumer who doesn't really care about any of that. You're just going to be able to provide more value for them. I'll be curious to see how much of this actually lands. And I also think that the workforce in the hospitality industry could be even more detrimental for price increases in North America, to an extent in America or USA for sure, if not everyone who is living here will be living here in a couple years, realizing where those people likely work frequently in the hospitality sector. That could have a much larger impact on the events industry, maybe even than tariffs. It really depends. Like the tariff thing, as a company, we've already made a bunch of orders in the last week for chips. No one's making them here. So, we've got to get them there, and we want to get them in before the end of the year. So I think, if you're thinking about buying movers or anything that's traditionally made in the East, here's your opportunity. That kind of surge is going to be interesting, because it's going to, I think, automatically change what people are trying to sell, and even before it happens. So like it's going to be interesting to make a bunch of purchases for inventory, and then also try not to discount them, but actually raise the prices on things when you already have too much inventory.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the advice, right? Is that, as I said, like all these retailers are stockpiling there. So you guys have ordered chips. I can say that for our CapEx strategy, we have moved away from, we've accelerated timeline on picking up some stuff, and we've moved away from the new and gone into the used.
Yeah,
And
sure.
the reason we did that is specifically because we wouldn't have to pay. There was no risk to tariff because it's already in the country. It's already
Yeah.
been repatriated, right? But I can't remember how to pronounce that word. Either way, it's landed in Canada now. So like that avoid, because even in the Canadian supply chain, if we were to order something from a major manufacturer, it's probably built in China. It goes through the States first and then comes to Canada. And so sometimes there's no direct line. And so that greatly affects how we are handling CapEx over the next 6 months to a year, is that we're like, okay, it can't be brand spanking new. It can't, because it's too much of a risk factor. So, Candace, what are your thoughts on where you see the biggest sort of economic impacts there?
Yeah, I do agree with Nick. I think there could be even more of an impact on the workforce changes than tariffs. I think a lot of people, even friends that I've talked to this week, are even saying that they've had to rush orders from, their suppliers, for instance, in China. They go ahead and stockpile, like you're saying, as much as they can, and they've already increased budgets. I mean, that happened months ago, leading up to the election as a, what if, just in case. So I think a lot of people are being proactive, and if people have not been proactive and they need this equipment and these things, it may be a little too late for them at this point. But I think a lot of people and have been proactive in this deal leading up to this. And this is nothing new, tariffs. We've seen this before. This was in his first term. So it's nothing shocking, to be honest with you. A lot of people are just doing what they did previously. Again, being proactive, making sure that they find alternate suppliers if needed in other factories in other countries, and making some of those connections. So it is time. It's past time just about, because we're ending the year. But yeah, I do agree with Nick. I think it'll be more on the workforce than tariffs.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say the workforce because it's the last sort of thing I want to touch on. Because again, this was such a prominent part of his platform, or was the idea that there could be sweeping deportations and we have to be realistic about the event industry that is so tied to the hospitality and travel industry that there are a significant amount of immigrant labor in hotels, in restaurants, in a lot of the things that we use. And I am reminded of a story of one of the first 5 or 6 big events that came back to Las Vegas after the pandemic, after everybody had left the industry because we were shut down for a year and a half. And somebody was saying a story about like, and this is, poor them. They had like this hour and a half lineup to get coffee at the MGM Grand on a break from their event because they could not staff. If those sort of deportations happen, and there's not going to be a lot of, I think, backfill in the industry to be able to fill those jobs. So like what kind of labor shortages are we potentially going to see?
I mean, I think it's going to be more pronounced in certain regions than others. I mean, it's going to affect, I would imagine, all of the United States, but other parts of the United States even harder, especially with as many gains that are taking place as far as economics in Texas. Like Texas is on fire. They're going to be competing with the NASDAQ. It's the largest economic center in the United States now. It's not New York City. So when you consider that and you consider how much energy is taking place there, normally events would follow, but that's an area that's absolutely predominantly immigrant labor that is making the hospitality industry work. So it really it'll be interesting to see how people choose where they host their events. I also think that on top of that, and this has been a trend for the last few years, I don't think it's going away, of pairing the mission, vision, and values of an organization with the destination that you're in. As the United States is definitely not a united front, being able to look at I guess the political landscape as well as the rest of the landscape of a destination. Can it accommodate my event? Are we politically aligned? And that's going to be a question. If you take that into consideration and what's the labor force look like, what they can actually accomplish, it's going to make site selection that much more complicated.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. We are a little bit over time, and I had to switch computers for the last minute there. So
I love how you have redundant, venues for you to record. Like that is a mark of a production
Thanks.
master.
You have your backups in place.
Yeah. I hope I never use backups, but to Candice's point at the beginning, like, yeah, how do you survive without them, right? So,
Right.
so thank you very much.
And now we can see all the friends behind.
Yes, true enough. My geek squad behind me is part of the. Again, I can test with Nick that I am nowhere near as geeky as that guy. But
You don't want to be. It comes with a lot of baggage. So you're
yeah, absolutely. So thank you guys very much for joining me on the panel again this month. Again, we are not going to be doing a panel in December just because we want everybody to relax and have a wonderful holiday. We will be joining you back on air in January of 2025. So please, like, if I don't get a chance to see you before the end of the year, have a wonderful end of the year and a happy new year. And we'll see you in January. And for your listeners, just a reminder, go to productionvaluematters.com. That's productionvaluematters.com. And you can subscribe there to get more access to deeper dives on these subjects, key articles, and past episodes, including time with Evan and Nick on their episodes from last year. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Production Value Matters, the business event podcast, is brought to you by Byrne Production Services. To find out more about Byrne Production Services and how putting on events can drive value for your business, visit byrneproductionservices.com. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And on behalf of the team here at Production Value Matters, thank you so much for listening.